Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into one of the most heartbreaking chapters yet. Just as the CEO was on his way to fulfill his promise to visit his recovering father, a devastating car accident left him fighting for his life. Tieu Lac collapsed in tears after hearing the shocking news, and the entire village fell into despair after losing the man who had given them hope and a new future. But will the CEO wake up and remember everything? Or has fate taken away more than anyone could imagine? Stay with us until the very end to uncover this emotional twist. And if you enjoy powerful family dramas filled with love, sacrifice, and unexpected turns, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next episode. The morning the CEO left the village felt strangely quiet. A thin layer of mist drifted across the strawberry fields as the first rays of sunlight painted the mountains gold. Tieu Lac stood outside their small house, holding their daughter in her arms, watching his pickup truck disappear along the winding road. Just before leaving, he had rolled down the window and smiled. "I'll be back before you know it." Their little girl waved both hands excitedly. "Papa, come home." He laughed, nodded one last time, and drove away. None of them knew. Those simple words would echo painfully through the rest of the day. The CEO drove calmly along the mountain highway. His thoughts were fixed on only one destination: the hospital, his father. For months, he had dreamed of this journey, not as the heir to a wealthy company, not as the former CEO of a powerful corporation, but as a son who had finally found the courage to stand before his father with nothing to hide. On the passenger seat rested a small basket. Inside were fresh strawberries from the village, homemade strawberry jam prepared by Tieu Lac, and a handwritten letter from the villagers. The village chief had insisted, "Take this. Tell your father his son changed more lives than he realizes." The CEO smiled every time he glanced at the basket. It wasn't expensive, but it meant everything. Back in the village, life continued as usual. The warehouse was busy preparing another shipment. Workers sorted fruit. Children played nearby. Farmers laughed while discussing next season's planting schedule. Tieu Lac spent the morning helping package strawberries. Even though she smiled, something felt different. She kept checking the time. Farmer Min noticed. "Missing him already?" She laughed softly. "He hasn't even been gone half a day." "Still, I don't know why. I just feel uneasy." The older farmer smiled reassuringly. "He survived worse. He'll be back before dinner." She tried to believe him. Several hours later, dark clouds slowly gathered over the mountain pass. Rain began falling without warning. The narrow road became slippery. Visibility dropped almost instantly. The CEO slowed his truck. He had driven this road many times, but today's storm was unusually fierce. Lightning flashed across the sky. Thunder rolled through the mountains. His phone buzzed. A message from Tieu Lac. "Drive safely. We're waiting for you." He smiled, then placed the phone back on the dashboard. "I'll be home soon." A few kilometers ahead, a large cargo truck rounded the corner. Neither driver expected what happened next. A section of the mountainside suddenly collapsed after hours of heavy rain. Rocks crashed onto the road. The cargo truck swerved violently to avoid them. Its rear trailer jackknifed across both lanes. The CEO reacted instantly. He slammed on the brakes. The tires screamed against the wet pavement. The pickup truck spun sideways. For one terrifying second, everything went silent. Then, a deafening crash echoed through the valley. Metal twisted, glass shattered. The pickup truck disappeared behind clouds of rain and dust. Several passing drivers immediately stopped. Someone shouted, "Call an ambulance." Another person ran toward the wreckage. The front of the truck had been crushed against the roadside barrier. Smoke slowly rose from the engine. One man carefully opened the damaged driver's door. The CEO was unconscious. Blood trickled down the side of his forehead. His breathing was faint, very faint. The basket of strawberries had spilled across the wet road. Bright red fruit rolled silently into the rain. Nearly an hour later, the hospital's emergency department erupted into activity. Doctors rushed the unconscious CEO into surgery. Nurses moved quickly through the corridors. The attending physician glanced at the medical chart. Severe head trauma, multiple fractures, internal bleeding. Prepare the operating room immediately. The doors closed. The red emergency light turned on. Meanwhile, back in the village, everyone continued working. No one knew, no one imagined anything was wrong. Until a police vehicle slowly entered the village. It stopped in front of the warehouse. The village chief frowned. Two officers stepped out. "Are you the family of Mr. CEO?" Silence. Something about the question made everyone's heart sink. The village chief answered carefully. "Yes." One officer removed his cap. "There has been an accident." The word spread through the village faster than wildfire. "An accident? No, that can't be true." Farmers dropped their baskets. Workers stopped loading trucks. Within minutes, everyone gathered outside the warehouse. The officer continued quietly. "He is alive, but his condition is critical." Those words shattered what little hope remained. Farmer Min immediately drove toward Tieu Lac's house. He didn't know how to tell her. No one did. She was feeding their daughter lunch when she heard the motorcycle stop outside. Seeing his pale face, her smile disappeared. "What happened?" He couldn't answer. She stepped closer. "What happened?" Still, silence. Then tears filled his eyes. "Tieu Lac, the CEO, he had an accident." The bowl slipped from her hands. It shattered across the floor. For several seconds, she simply stared at him, as though she hadn't understood. Then she whispered, "No." Farmer Min lowered his head. "They're trying to save him." Her knees suddenly gave way. She collapsed onto the floor. Their little daughter looked at her mother in confusion. "Mama, where's Papa?" Tieu Lac covered her mouth, unable to breathe. Tears poured down her face. "No, he promised he'd come home." Within an hour, the entire village gathered outside her house. No one spoke loudly. No one knew what to say. The warehouse stood empty. The delivery trucks remained parked. The strawberry fields were silent. For the first time since the CEO had arrived, the village had stopped moving. It felt as though the heart of the entire community had suddenly disappeared. The village chief looked toward the mountains. His voice trembled. "We owe everything we have today to him. And now, we can't even help him." Not far away, hidden inside a black luxury sedan parked beneath the trees, a woman quietly lowered her sunglasses. She watched the grieving villagers without showing any emotion. She picked up her phone. The accident happened. A calm voice answered from the other end. "Was it successful?" The woman looked toward the distant road leading to the city. "He survived. For now." The voice remained silent for several seconds, then quietly replied, "Keep watching. If he wakes up, everything changes." The rain continued through the night. Back at the village, no one could sleep. Usually the streets would be quiet after sunset, with only the sound of crickets and the occasional barking dog breaking the silence. But tonight every light remained on. Inside Tieu Lac's small home, the atmosphere was painfully heavy. She sat motionless beside her daughter's bed. The little girl had fallen asleep while clutching the stuffed rabbit her father had bought for her. Every few minutes, she murmured in her sleep, "Papa." Each time Tieu Lac heard that tiny voice, her heart broke a little more. She reached over and gently stroked her daughter's hair. "I'll bring Papa home." She whispered the words. But even she didn't know whether she believed them. Before dawn, several villagers prepared to leave for the city. The village chief, Farmer Min, and a dozen others climbed into pickup trucks carrying food, blankets, and supplies. "We're going to the hospital," the village chief said firmly. "He stood beside us when we had nothing. Now it's our turn to stand beside him." Within minutes, the convoy slowly drove out of the village. Nobody cared about the day's harvest. Nobody mentioned business. There were things far more important than strawberries. Several hours later, the hospital waiting area was filled with familiar faces. Tieu Lac rushed in carrying her daughter. The moment she saw the red emergency light above the operating room, she froze. It was still on. That single light seemed to drain every bit of strength from her body. She slowly walked toward the door and placed one trembling hand against the cold wall. "You promised. You said you'd come home." Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. Behind her, the villagers stood quietly. No one interrupted. No one tried to comfort her. Some pain was simply too deep for words. Inside the operating room, doctors worked tirelessly. The lead surgeon looked at the monitors. "Blood pressure is unstable. Prepare another transfusion." A nurse nodded immediately. Another doctor carefully examined the brain scans. "The swelling is getting worse. We have to relieve the pressure now." Every second became a race against time. Outside, no one knew what was happening. They could only wait. Hours passed. Morning turned into afternoon. Afternoon slowly faded toward evening. Finally, the operating room doors opened. Everyone jumped to their feet. The chief surgeon removed his mask. His face showed complete exhaustion. The surgery was successful. A wave of relief swept through the hallway. Several villagers burst into tears. Tieu Lac almost collapsed with gratitude, but the doctor's next sentence stopped every smile. "However, he has not regained consciousness. There is severe head trauma. The next 72 hours will be critical. If he doesn't wake up..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone understood. Tieu Lac was finally allowed to enter the intensive care unit. The room was almost silent. Machines beeped steadily beside the bed. The CEO lay completely still. Bandages covered part of his head. His right arm rested in a cast. Bruises marked his face. Tieu Lac slowly approached. She had never seen him like this. This was the man who had faced kidnappers without fear. The man who had rebuilt an entire village from nothing. The man who always smiled and said everything would be all right. Now, he looked so fragile. She gently took his hand. It was warm. That small warmth became the only thing giving her hope. "You once told me," she whispered through tears, "that no storm lasts forever. So please, wake up. Our daughter is waiting. The whole village is waiting. And I'm waiting too." A single tear fell onto his hand. Outside the room, the villagers gathered together. Farmer Min stared through the window. "It feels impossible. He was standing beside us yesterday." The village chief sighed deeply. Life changes in a single moment. One elderly farmer quietly spoke. "We can't let everything he built fall apart." Everyone turned toward him. The warehouse, the city store, the fields. "He trusted us. We have to protect them until he comes back." Slowly, every villager nodded. At that moment, something changed. The CEO had once carried the village on his shoulders. Now, the village would carry his dream. Meanwhile, far away in the city, inside the company headquarters, news of the accident spread quickly. Employees whispered in the hallways. Some refused to believe it. Others quietly wondered if fate had finally ended the struggle between mother and son. Inside the executive office, the CEO's mother sat alone. An assistant entered cautiously. "Madam, the operation succeeded." "He survived." She closed her eyes for a brief moment. relief, or disappointment. No one could tell. What condition? Still unconscious. She slowly stood and walked toward the window. So, he still has a chance. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. For the first time in years, uncertainty crossed her face. She had wanted control, she had wanted power, but she had never imagined her son lying between life and death. Was this really the outcome she wanted? Before she could answer her own thoughts, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. She answered. A cold male voice spoke first. "The accident wasn't enough. We can finish it." Her expression instantly hardened. "No," she replied firmly. "No more." The man sounded surprised. "What?" "I said no." She ended the call without another word. For several long seconds, she stood silently. Then she whispered to herself, "Whatever happens next, he must survive." Back at the hospital, night fell once again. Tieu Lac refused to leave the CEO's bedside. Their daughter had fallen asleep, curled beside her grandmother in the waiting room. The villagers took turns keeping watch outside. No one wanted the family to face this alone. The corridor remained quiet. Only the steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the room. Then, just after midnight, a soft sound broke the silence. Beep, beep, beep. Tieu Lac looked up. She felt something. The fingers she had been holding all day moved, just slightly. She froze, then leaned closer. Did you move?" Another tiny movement, almost impossible to notice. But this time, she was certain. Tears instantly filled her eyes. She pressed the emergency call button. "Doctor, hurry! I think he's coming back." Outside the room, footsteps echoed rapidly through the hallway as doctors and nurses rushed toward the intensive care unit. And for the first time since the terrible accident, a tiny spark of hope appeared once again. But no one yet knew whether the CEO would wake up remembering everything, or whether the accident had stolen far more than anyone had feared. After leaving the village to fulfill his promise of visiting his recovering father, the CEO is caught in a devastating car accident that leaves him critically injured. The shocking news reaches Tieu Lac, who collapses in despair, unable to believe the man who promised to return may never come home. As doctors fight to save his life through a difficult operation, the entire village falls silent, mourning the possible loss of the man who transformed their future. Refusing to let his dream disappear, the villagers vow to protect the warehouse, the city store, and everything he built until he recovers. Meanwhile, mysterious figures continue watching from the shadows, suggesting the accident may not have been a coincidence. Just when all hope seems lost, the CEO's fingers suddenly move in the hospital. Will he finally wake up? And if he does, will he remember everything that happened?